So today I'm going to let you guys just come along with me on an entire session, and hopefully just being able to see what I do on a daily basis will help to give you some inspiration about what to do, but not necessarily something that you want to follow as a prescription, because what I'm doing obviously should look a lot different than what you're doing, with our goals being different starting points. So I never want people to watch like my training sessions and then immediately try to like carbon copy that, because it wouldn't make sense for somebody else doing it. Everything that I do whenever I'm choosing my programming for the day is hyper specific, not only to what's going on kind of on average in my training, but also what I'm feeling like on that particular day. So I'm going to kind of go through and hopefully I can give you a little bit of insight as to kind of my thought process whenever I'm deciding on my programming for the day, what movements that I'm going to do, and kind of give you a little bit of a inside look as to how I'm able to kind of manage that on a day-to-day basis without having to follow a super strict program. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. And you guys are welcome to kind of borrow some of this structure if your goals are similar enough. But again, like I don't even follow a super strict program. It's super prescriptive because again, I'm not really sure what my conditioning is going to show up as on any given day. It's just going to be something that you have to assess and figure out on that day. So I like to start every session off with a 5-minute plank, or at least some option where my hands are on the floor. And for me, I've kind of built up to about 5 minutes, which is a really long time for some people, but personally, I just kind of think of it as like, 5 minutes is in almost any other context a really short amount of time. So I'm just setting aside a little bit of time here to be on my hands. And the reason I like to do it as a plank instead of, I guess it's kind of just more as a static position as opposed to walking around when I'm first getting started, is because when you're walking around, you're like thinking about like the task of moving your body. But whenever you're kind of stationary and you're just holding your weight, you're more focused on the task of assessing your body. So I use this time to figure out where maybe I'm feeling a little bit of tightness, especially if I'm feeling any soreness. You can even start to work out some of that stuff if it's like in your shoulders or your wrists or any of these kind of associated posting muscles or areas, just by kind of moving around a little bit and then getting some load in them. And also, you'll probably notice I'm not being super duper strict with my plank. Like, a lot of people think planks have to look like a super specific way. But if you think about it, it's just weight bearing on your hands, and then your body's elongated. But a lot of times I'll kind of change it up a little bit. I usually don't have to decrease the intensity this much by like shifting back, but sometimes I will. And it really, like I said, depends on how I'm feeling when I show up for that day's session. Another way I like to do that is by shifting back into downward facing dog, and this is one of the opportunities I get early in the day to start to actually do a little bit of stretching for my lower body as well, because coming off of a long period of inactivity, like sleeping 5, 6, 7 hours, that's enough to make you a little bit tighter, even if you're normally a pretty active person. So I like to kind of shake the rust off during this static hold as well by incorporating a little bit of lower body stretching, both for the posterior chain, so getting the hammies, calves, and low back, and then also even throwing in a little bit of back extension here. Just let the knees drop and switch to like an upward facing dog. And this also, just kind of mixing it up and adding in that variety, has a secondary benefit of allowing you to move around your wrists a little bit more. So if you're always just holding like a very specific static position, generally you're just going to operate in one range of motion, where maybe you have some strength and mobility there, but just in the neighboring ranges don't. So by kind of shifting through some of these positions that maybe aren't a perfect plank, I get a little bit of exposure to that, and it gives me some idea of kind of what I can expect if I'm doing that or I'm entering into those ranges during more intense movements like handstands or L-sits or whatever. I also like to move my hands around a lot. Excuse the mats. These ones are kind of tacky or sticky, which is really great for practicing like calisthenic stuff because you get like a really good grip on the ground. But for certain other things, like whenever I'm trying to practice a little breakdancing or something, this isn't ideal. So this is just an environmental constraint. That's what it's called. Where you have a kind of a limiting factor based on the environment. And that's another thing you want to take into consideration with what you're doing for the day is those environmental factors. I mean, if you just have a program that's like do this many times at this intensity, and it's just, super duper strict like that, the first time you run into, some sort of environmental constraint, like, maybe having a tackier or more slippery surface, maybe that makes the movement that you're working on a little bit more challenging. And now, like, the challenge level for that prescriptive program has now gone up a lot. And was that ever in the original plan? Like, right? Like if I have to train somewhere else and that makes the workout a lot harder, should I stick to the original program like super diligently, or should I adapt it and adjust it so that the challenge level stays kind of relatively the same as the last time I did it, maybe just a little bit harder? And so that's one of the reasons that I don't always do the exact same thing, because if I were, if you do, you're not. If you are always doing the exact same thing, but you're doing it in different environments and you're doing it with different individual constraints, like as you get stronger or weaker or sick or tired or sore or whatever, it's not the same. It's not the same. It's not the same to do kind of a 5x5 bro lift when you're sick as when you're feeling super duper fresh. So those things matter, all of those other variables and factors, and that's why, again, I'm not like a super big fan of hyper prescriptive programming and coaching, just because, again, I don't think it suits really anybody except for people who live like a super duper controlled life. And even then, we can only control so much. So if people are using that successfully, it's because they're also secretly, pretty skilled, or at least are getting some assistance with making adjustments whenever they need to. So my whole thing is everybody should be equipped to be able to make adjustments on the fly on a day-to-day basis for their own training, because if you're not going to do it, then who? You can't rely on a coach to change every single aspect of your life every single day of it. Right? They're there to provide some insight for you, but also, coaches don't want to, just being a coach for years, coaches don't want to spoon feed you forever. We might want to keep you around as a client, but if they're a good coach, they want to see you progress. And part of that means kind of like taking on a little bit more autonomy with your own training. So you can kind of see how the way that I approach these longer static holds is more palatable than just like, again, holding like a super duper structured plank in quote unquote perfect form, which I don't really think exists. And I'm getting all these exposure to all these different ranges, all these different intensities. I'm not just challenging one part of my body or a very specific group of body parts. As I change my hand position, this is going from supporting myself with my shoulders and triceps to supporting myself with my shoulders and biceps. I can go from hip extension to hip flexion, spinal extension to spinal flexion. So, if you're doing a good plank, if you're doing a plank practice, kind of like how I do it, where you're exploring and playing and using it as your laboratory to assess your body, and then also kind of experiment with other things, then it's a full body practice. It's not just for your upper body. It's not just for your hands and wrists. This is where I practice a lot of stuff that I, just not even sure about. Maybe stuff that I just kind of experimenting and playing with. Like, for example, putting weight to the tops of my toes. This is just something I've been kind of working on a little bit lately to help to kind of prevent stubbing my toes during jiu-jitsu more. Just kind of fortify that area, and it's definitely been helping. But I have this time that I set aside every day, so I can kind of work on stuff like that. That's not a major priority, but definitely something that I'm interested in, and this is kind of my laboratory to workshop in. So, check the time real quick. All right, so ended up at about 10 minutes for the plank today, which, it's not super uncommon. A lot of times I'll set out to do a certain amount, I'll end up doing more. And then, other times, maybe I set out to do a certain amount and, I call it quits early. And so it just comes back to, I'm not following a super prescriptive plan. I'm trying to use some critical thinking to make sure that I get a right amount of exposure for today based on how I'm feeling today. And if you're doing this every day, it becomes pretty intuitive. It's not a super complicated process. One of the things that I've been working on lately is shoulder extension, right? Which is taking the arm back this way. Something that, obviously don't get a lot of with traditional bear crawl, traditional plank. So I've been wanting to introduce it more, specifically just for like my jiu-jitsu and stuff, being able to post and plant and be able to support weight whenever I'm in some of those more extreme ranges. So what I'm going to do for today's training is I'm going to try to basically just spend more time there. And that's how I like to think about it. I'm not going to be like, I'm going to do X amount of X movement. I'm just going to try to spend more time in shoulder extension today. And then if I'm doing this regularly, so like say maybe I devote 2 or 3 of my weekly sessions to working on shoulder extension, I'm going to try to improve like what I'm able to accomplish in that time. So when I first started these, like I really had pretty bad shoulder extension. Wasn't good, and so there was a lot fewer options at the very beginning. So basically I was just kind of like trying to hold my body in this shape, and I'd set a timer for like maybe 5 minutes. And then now I've kind of started to work into some higher intensity options, like being able to kind of pick my feet up, and I'm going to work on some of that stuff today. It's a killer tricep workout. But before I get into any of that, what I like to do is kind of work my way through the lower intensity options and the more extreme ranges of motion. So getting really deep into that shoulder extension and get comfortable there, because that's going to give me all the information I need to know about like how my body responds to those movements today. Because I can tell you, like, there's not been any situations or circumstances throughout the day where I've had to like reach back this far, and definitely not anywhere I've had to load those ranges. So I like to just kind of start off, and again, this is similar to like my plank practice, and I could even have done some of this reverse tabletop during that, but I've got the time today, so I've decided I'm gonna like set aside maybe at least 5 or 10 minutes to work on some low intensity shoulder extension work and then high intensity shoulder extension work. And I feel comfortable, kind of playing around with different movements and stuff like this, and not feeling like I'm straying too far from the skills that I was working on before, because they're all in the same skill set or skill family. And so I know that if I'm working on like shoulder extension, reverse tabletop, if I'm working on L-sit, V-sit, mono stuff, like I'm still bearing weight on my hands. I'm still depressing my scapula. So I'm still getting a lot of the same exposure. And then throughout the week, it's a lot easier for me to integrate kind of my normal stuff, because and I'll talk about this in a later video, but a lot of the training that I get done throughout the day is not in these sessions. These sessions are really just kind of to collect all of the movements and exposure that I can't get throughout my day. So this is a good example of that. Like I said, there's not going to be a lot of opportunities for me to get some really deep shoulder extension under load just naturally throughout my day. At least at this point, I haven't really figured out like a way to integrate that as well as some of my other movements. And so I feel comfortable setting aside time today to work on this because it's not as integrated, because I know that handstand, planche, my hand walking, a lot of my mobilization, a lot of the stuff that I'm working on hanging, all that stuff is pretty integrated into my day, and I kind of get some exposure to that as I pass under my pull-up bar, or for example, I teach at a studio a few times a week, and so during the warm-ups and the cool-downs, I always do some handstand holds, some static handstand holds, and that's an example of free training because I'm already there, I'm already doing it, and so I'm just kind of like rearranging my movements within time I already set aside. So I'm not setting aside any additional time to do it. So if I'm doing handstand holds during a warm-up and a cool-down of a class that I'm teaching while everyone else is doing their warm-up and cool-down, then I get that exposure I would have just normally been standing there. So it's not anything that I had to set aside time for, and that kind of frees up more time to work on other things that I'm interested in, like this. So yeah, just that low intensity work, like you'd be surprised how your body feels after getting that in. It's kind of like going for a walk before you go for a run. Like, I mean, if I were to go straight into L-sit and potentially trying to work on some V-sit stuff, I haven't reached back behind me at all today, or if I did it for like 2 seconds or 30 seconds while I warmed up, right? That'd be like getting up out of bed and then walking around for 2 seconds or 30 seconds and then going for a run. It's not really the best way to prepare your body for that, and definitely not the best way to sort of assess your body to see kind of how that run may end up going. So I'm a big fan of just hanging out in those kind of lower intensity options for a while and seeing how my body responds to it, because 9 times out of 10 this is enough here to make progress. If you're doing this every single day, just doing a light version of it, I don't mean this specific movement, but a lower intensity version of what you're trying to get to, but over a longer period of time, be surprised how many little tertiary benefits, how many little kind of aspects of the skill you didn't even recognize that you can improve through things like that. Skill, strength, endurance, mobility. A lot of it comes from this low intensity work, and then the high intensity work is really just to kind of raise the bar so that you can keep applying progressive overload. But I feel like it's really reinforced with the low intensity stuff, and that's why so much of my practice is crawling or plank or just hanging, because I found that it makes the high intensity work more effective and it makes it a lot more comfortable. Okay, so I'm gonna keep it pretty light today. I'm just gonna go through and basically the way I structure my high intensity work. Sometimes I'll set some goals for myself that if I'm like really, really tuned in to a movement, like I know basically how many I can do pretty much every time, and I've got that consistency with it. But with a lot of movements, you don't get consistency until long after you have a little bit of proficiency, like long after you unlock it. So with movements like my V-sit or my L-sit, I'm just gonna see what I can get done in X amount of time, and then each time I come back to it, I'm gonna try to do a little bit better, but I'm not gonna say like I have to do this, because I don't want to set a fail condition. Like, there is no fail condition for a session, because I'm gonna train and then I'm gonna train tomorrow. So for now, it's just gonna be like set a timer, and whatever I can get done in I'm gonna be proud of that, because I know I worked hard. And then next time I train this, I'll try to do a little bit better, and over time, that's how you build skills, and that's how I built pretty much every skill I've ever developed. All right, so for my high intensity work, I'm gonna set a 5-minute timer, and I'm mostly just gonna be working on kind of L-sit holds, some static holds, and exploring kind of how heavy I can hold and how high up I can hold my hips. So every rep won't look the same, and what I'm trying to accomplish with each rep won't be the same. But again, it's just kind of what I can get done in 5 minutes. I always like to set an extra 10 seconds here just to kind of give myself a little buffer. Yeah, and then we'll just go ahead and jump into it. So because I'm already nice and warmed up, I'm just gonna go for just a static hold at first. So up. Ooh. Felt good. Nice 5 seconds. I'm gonna wait to open up my legs, see if I can get my hips a little bit higher first, and then once I open my legs up, it's really, really difficult to lift your hips any higher because it extends that lever and that makes things heavier. So let's see if I can, I'm gonna do another 5-second hold, see if I can get my hips up just a little bit higher this time around. Ooh. Okay, I think that's the max height. Like I said, I'm not really, I'm not very good, I guess by the standards of like my other skills that I've developed, at shoulder extension, back extension, just things that don't normally enter into kind of the style of training that you do or your day-to-day activities. It's always going to seem just way further away. And it kind of goes back to my point of, that low intensity work supports the high intensity work. What you do on a daily basis really dictates kind of the accessibility of the movements that you want to work on, which is why lower body movements are generally so much more accessible for people because we already walk. Okay, I'm gonna start opening up my legs now a little bit, adding a little bit of intensity, and also showing you guys how inflexible my hamstrings are at the same time, so it's win-win. Whew. Now I feel a little bit looser. It's a lot on the quads, mostly. That's always been a struggle of mine. I've always told people I am naturally like one of the least flexible people I've ever known. I work on it, at least in certain areas, every day. The areas that are going to affect me the most, so ankle mobility, wrist mobility, shoulders, but yeah, anything that I haven't devoted a lot of time to working on specifically, trash. So one of those things are my hamstrings, and believe it or not, I actually have spent a good amount of time working on them, just not as consistently as the other things, again because it doesn't come up in my day-to-day life as much. So here we go. Oh, wanted a controlled descent or exit out of that, but lost my balance a little bit. That happens sometimes when you're going really hard. It's you kind of devote a little bit too much attention to one aspect of the skill. That's why it's really important to get a lot of variations of the skill that you're working on. Supported options, unsupported options. That way you force yourself to run into those barriers, and running into them gives you an opportunity to correct them. So balancing with my feet in front of me, not something I've spent a lot of time working on. All right, I think I got 2 more attempts in me. I'm gonna make sure to get 2 more in, no matter what the timer says. Slightly better rep. Oh, whew. Starting to break a little sweat now. I think I'm gonna leave the sweatshirt on though. I like to get a little hot for some reason. Feels like I can do more. Okay. I think I'm gonna let the time run for 20 seconds. That'll be the rest of my recovery. And since I've already kind of committed to doing 1 more rep, I'm just going to try to make it my best rep and see what I can do. Obviously, it's going to look pretty similar to the ones that I've already done. So we can go ahead and turn the timer off. I have 1 rep left. And here we go. we go. So yeah, that's my VSIP training for the day. But it's also more than that. It's, you know, that's my wrist conditioning, a lot of it for the day. That's a lot of my mobility work for the day. So, you know, again, whenever you're doing that, you know, critical thinking, and you're changing your sessions from day to day, depending on what you need, what you're capable of, then you'll actually start to see all the connections between the skills that you're working on and all the different goals you have. And you can help to kind of like synergize these sessions where, you know, I'm not just working on one thing. That way I don't have to work on a different thing each day of the week. I'm kind of working on a little bit of everything during each session, with the focus kind of biasing something more than the others, but incorporating just enough of everything to cut down on long periods of activity and make sure that, you know, I'm getting that exposure in, because we actually require a lot more work than people think. But it doesn't have to be super hard. It just has to be consistent. So awesome. Thanks for joining me at this session, guys. And you know, I'll upload another one soon so we can show you guys some different aspects of my training methodology and my practices, and some of the other cool tools that I use. So thanks.